you came to Oxford to speak, so this is an Oxford University podcast, and as Oxford students facing the tough work grind and having our own fair share of writing block on late night essays, we're wondering how you deal with writer's block as an artist. I write some poetry myself, and it's a really big hurdle and can often lead to a lack of motivation. How do you deal with that?
I'm actually going through like some pretty major writer's block on two separate projects for two completely separate reasons right now. And the big thing that I've learned with writer's block is it's not only like an individual thing, like, different writers get blocked over different things, but it's also per project. It can be entirely different. So one of the projects I'm working on is for a really prestigious institution. And the thing which is blocking me is the last person who wrote for that institution was Seamus Heaney. And that's some very big shoes to fill. So it's the last poet that they had worked with 25 years ago was him. And it's very hard to kind of go, well, they've picked you for a reason. They like your work for a reason. They don't want you to write like Seamus Heaney. They want you to write like yourself. So that was a big barrier to break through. It's like, how do you follow up someone who's larger than life? And the way that I've kind of been breaking through that barrier is constantly reminding myself in the mornings before I start working. So I work on this project first thing in the morning when my brain doesn't have the time to start listening to my inner critic. So before I can listen to my inner critic, I've already started work on the project. So a lot of the good writing on this project happens then. And the second project I'm working on is a book which is a sequel. It's a sequel poetry collection to one of my earlier books. And I've never written a sequel before. And that is such a block for me because I'm like, it's a first time. It's the first time I'm writing a sequel. And everyone, there's that saying, right? The sequel is never as good as the first. And I've got that block in my head kind of going, oh God, do I make it enough like the first book that people kind of look at it and go, this was such a good continuation of the first book? Or do I just go extremely crazy and just make it quite different, but just with similar themes? So there's, as Robert Frost said, there are two roads that I could take. There are two paths. And I'm stuck because I don't know which path to take. So finally, what I've decided is I'm just going to listen to my creative brain and just make it as crazy and free as possible instead of trying to make it, trying to stick to a traditional rule that I've set for myself with that first book. So I think with writer's block, you kind of have to identify the source of the problem because every writer's block is happening for a completely different reason. And when you identify the source of the problem, whether it's like tiredness, whether it's, I don't think I can do it, whether it's a confidence thing, whether it is a personal block because you're writing about something quite vulnerable, it depends on the reason. And then to write your way out of that reason, I would say free write. You don't have to write about the thing that you're blocked on, but just start free writing. Even if you're saying I have writer's block 20 times, 30 times on a page, just free write your way out of it because it's the only way to get through it. Like they say, right? You can't go over it. You can't go under it. The only way is through it. Writer's block is like that. The only way is going through it and identifying the problem. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think people have such an image of poetry as there's sort of no expectations placed upon you. You're completely free to kind of do whatever you want. But in a weird way, you kind of have your own expectations impinging upon you. I was going to ask, that must be so different from the corporate world, which you transformed over from before you became a full-time poet, where you have very rigid structures, you can't get writer's block. You just know what you have to do. So very rigid expectations from people. How did you find that adjustment over? What liberties do you have now? Is there anything you miss?
I think people have this idea that when you move from a corporate, quite traditional space to this very free space with creativity and so much freedom, that is quite an easy transition, but it's not, because the human beings respond very well to structure. And what a corporate job does is that it gives you that structure. It gives you the 9 to 5. You have someone you have to answer to. In a lot of ways, it takes the responsibilities of setting your own work it takes it away from you. You know what you're doing. You can almost work in like robot mode. And that's the thing that I used to hate because it used to limit my creativity. But the minute I got the freedom to be able to explore, it's almost like I was like a deer in the headlights going, oh my God, I can do anything I want. I can create anything I want. Where do you begin? It's the fear of the blank page. And I think the real beauty was finding my own structure within the freedom. And it's taken a long time to develop that. It sometimes takes an artist like 10 years to find the thing that really works for them. But for me, it was very much, I wake up in the morning, I read, I free write, and I do like 3 morning pages before I get into my actual writing. And my morning pages are just, they say that you have to get out a lot of bad writing to be able to get to the good writing. So the morning pages are that. They're like the crap, the nonsense in my head, the compulsive thoughts, the anger, the grief, whatever I'm carrying from the previous day, I put that in. And then I start afresh on my work. And usually the hardest project first. So the hardest thing I have to do, I try to get rid of it to start with, and then I move on to the other things. But it took a long time to find a structure that worked for me, right down to the kind of notebooks I like to write in, the kind of pens I like to use, the kind of equipment I enjoy. And it's, if I don't get, Stephen King does this very interesting thing. The first thing what he does when he gets up at about 5 a.m. is he goes for a walk for an hour. So every writer has their own way, their own structure of dealing with things, but that structure takes a long time to develop. Like you can't just, I think people think that once you publish your debut and your debut is successful, that's it. You've got it made or something like that. But when you're a debut novelist or a debut poet, or you've just done your first book, you suddenly start worrying about that second book, and that structure really helps with the second book, because your first book, you write in an abyss or a void. You write it without thinking about the expectations. You write it without thinking about, who's waiting for this book. And so you kind of write it in a very haphazard way. And there's a really beautiful flow to every debut book that you will ever read, every debut chapter. And I love those flows, because that flow is like the rawness of the writer's voice and the spirit, right? And the second book has to have the structure and the things that you've learned. So I do think you spend a long time developing that as a writer, and it really depends on where you come from. I think I'm one of those people who believes very strongly in discipline when it comes to write. I have to write every day. If I'm not writing something every day, I feel like I'm losing grips on my craft.